Hello, ladies and gents. We're on the module A328. Block 4, How Are Empires Experience? Unit 17, The End of the Ottoman Empire. Page 319. The term millet originally referred to religious communities. It gave minority religious groups limited power to regulate their own affairs within the Muslim Ottoman Empire. Non-Muslim had to be part of the millet to be considered citizens. In the 19th century, millets acquired an additional meaning, incorporating the notion of nationality, and reforms changed the structure of millets. The cartoon shows John Bull, who represents Britain, and Sultan Abalias shaking hands. The caption, the illustrations, convalescent is an ironic reference to Abelaziz, who is depicted in a European style uniform and Ottoman attire in the form of a fez and cloak. The term convalescent implies that he was recovering from an illness and is a reference to Tsar Nicholas II's phrase, the sick man of Europe. Here, John Ball references and ridicules a statement declaring Sultan Abdulaziz had been cured by Crimean doctors. This is by Britain, France, and Piedmont, Sardinia, who had come to the Ottoman Empire help against the Russians. Before the Crimean War, the Empire had avoided European loans so as to prevent European meddling in Ottoman affairs. But the Crimean War changed this, as the Ottoman state took out loans to help finance the war. One loan led to another, resulting in financial crisis by 1875. This resulted in the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a consortium of the foreign creditors, who helped oversee parts of the Ottoman economy and repayment of the loans. The debt administration oversaw the collection of taxes, much of which was used to repay loans, while yet more loans financed further public utilities and investment according to the Quartarit. The worst consequence of the debt crisis may have been the loss of authority of Ottoman state in the eyes of its own people, whose taxes increasingly went to the foreign debt administration. Capitulation to European intervention. 19th century had produced tension in the political relations among the powers, particularly over the Eastern question, but as long as they did not encroach on each other's ambitions, they are able to tolerate each other. The empire's advantage or trump card was general desire of the European powers for it to survive as a political entity. For its total disintegration was a worse alternative. Since 1856, the empire had become increasingly financially indebted to European powers, resulting in bankruptcy in 1879. This led to growing European involvement in Ottoman economic affairs, including communications, transport, services, factories, mines, and trade. France, Germany, and Britain were the empire's main creditors and supplied advisors to the Ottoman government. An example of European involvement was the German Baghdad Railway, Germany's ambition to establish itself as a friend of the empire and to expand its interest in the region threatened the other great powers who themselves had territorial ambitions. Support for Arab independence. The promise to support Arab independence and to establish a new caliphate assumed, of course, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the Sultan's caliphate. As there could not be two in existence simultaneously, MacMahon undermines the current caliph by referring to Hussein as a potential future caliph being an Arab of true race. In referring to his enemies, MacMahon uses emotive language, referring to the Turks as the old oppressor, thus reminding Hussein of what was at stake in fighting for an Arab state independent from the Ottoman Empire. MacMahon puts off discussion of limits and boundaries by referring to the heat of war, thus buying Arab support without making any clear promises. Some of the causes of our Arab alienation from the Ottoman Empire include the following. Arab withdrew their support for the Ottoman Empire following the revolution of the Young Turks, when the Society, Union and Progress took over the administration of the empire. As a result of their rule, the empire entered several disastrous wars and suffered loss of territory and prestige. Wars brought suffering of Arabs, particularly in the Holy Land. The Society of Union and Progress destroyed one of the 5 vital precepts of Islam, the fast of Ramadan, and enforced other innovations that ran counter of the fundamental laws of Islam. Explain the decline of the empire. Failure to respond to the changes of modernity and disagreements over the need for reform. Wars, including the First World War, as catalysts of decline. The outcome and aftermath of the First World War. Bernard Lewis paints a picture of an empire that was essentially medieval and, as such, had little chance of survival in a world of modernizing states. He identifies the apathy of the ruling class to adopt ideas and practice which stemmed from Christian origins. This led to the Ottoman economy stagnating. By the end of the 18th century, Lewis detects the utter exhaustion of the old traditions and the absence of a new creative impulses. The Ottoman Empire, he contends, failed to respond to the challenge which produced the nation states of 16th century Europe. Instead, it reverted to a medieval state, but with the burden of modern bureaucracy and military. This focus on the unwillingness of the Ottomans to modernize is an important part of the story of the empire's ultimate demise. It's easy to see how this view might lead Lewis to conclude that the empire was bound to decline. Mustafi Sakal argues that the government's decision to intervene in an intro-European war in 1914 played a crucial role, but he also posits that a radical change in the government after January 1913 suggests that by this point it was already too late for the empire to unite diverse peoples as it once had. Ryan Gingeras stressed the paradox of the cohesion of the empires despite the many setbacks, and in particular the fact that, even with the territorial losses, the legitimacy of the royal family has not undermined, and that Ottoman nationalism did not work against loyalties of the many nationalities who lived with the empire. Gingeras is struck by the durability of the Ottoman state. In stark contrast with Lewis' stance, this is a much more positive interpretation of the function of the empire right until the end of the war. Which interpretation do you find the most convincing? On 29th of November 1967, the last British personnel were helicoptered out to Aden, marking the end of the British Army's colonial counter-insurgency campaign there. The event also marked the end of the Federation of South Arabia and nearly 130 years of British rule in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. Britain's initial involvement, starting in 1839, was to secure maritime routes to India. Later on, the area was developed as an important strategic asset as British air and naval base, safeguarding access to Middle Eastern oil supplies during the Cold War. But what are the main forces contributing to this retreat? According to Guy Arnold, Aden represents a classic example of a colonial possession treated by the imperial power solely as the imperial convenience. Not only were few, if any, efforts made to improve the conditions of the people, but by and large they were treated with contempt. And even Even when nationalism was sweeping through the Arab world in the 1950s, the British still behaved as though they only had to manipulate a few backward Arab tribes. They learnt their lesson in one of the most humiliating end of empire defeats which they were to suffer. The unit focuses on these events and British imperialism. More specifically, it looks at the British imperialism in the Middle East during the era of post-war decolonisation, picking up some of the themes explored in the block introduction and building on the previous unit on the Ottoman Empire. Section 1 details how the mandate system consolidated British power in the Middle East after the First World War. It concludes by exploring the impact of rising anti-colonialism, nationalisms, Second World War events, and the Cold War on British hegemony in the region. Sections 2 to 5 further expand on the diverse ways in which British power was challenged and undermined, with particular focus on British informal rule in post-independence Iraq and formal rule in its crown colony of Aden. It then unpacks the ways in which these developments, along with key local, regional, and international factors, interacted to drive this process of decolonisation. Throughout the unit, terms such as the era of decolonisation are used, but we cannot read them with an awareness of their limitations. While many countries achieved constitutional independence during this period, this was a period of vigorous imperial action and a revivalist empire, especially in the 1950s, geared towards maintaining Britain's global role in a post-war world order rather than disassembling it. Despite the relative decline of Britain on the world stage at this time, Britain maintained its at the same time, economic movement emerged from threat of inspiration, resistance, subverting, ultimately reducing British power in the region. This unit explores the seemingly contradictory but simultaneous process of construction and deconstruction. Britain's desire to inaugurate what John Darwin had posited as the fourth British Empire also helps explain the intensity of costly counter-insurgency campaigns such as that in Aden and the persistence of British informal rule in Iraq, despite the granting of nominal independence there in 1930. British influence in Iraq persisted until a COP in July 1958 finally severed the British connection. The unit will also explore how tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union shaped these processes of decolonisation and the impact of extra-regional events such as those in Palestine and Egypt. Finally, we will look at the extent to which new international organisations facilitated decolonisation. British decolonisation in the Middle East. British imperialism in the Middle East, the post-Ottoman context. The East was named from the West, never having enjoyed the advantage of a name that sprang from the region itself. As we saw in Unit 2, when comparing the 1914-1926 world maps, and in Unit 17, the frontiers of the former Ottoman Empire were redrawn after its defeat in the First World War. New boundaries created new nation-states in the Middle East, and these didn't align neatly with the tribal or ethnic identities of their inhabitants. What was the Middle East? Loosely comprising the territory stretching from Turkey to Egypt in the west and to Iran in the east. The Middle East originally was understood to consist of territory between the Europeans called the Near and Far East. Conceiving the Middle East a colonial invention, as explored in the previous unit, after the Ottoman Empire's collapse, Winston Churchill, as Secretary of the State for the Colonies, incorporated Near East of the Eastern Mediterranean and Britain's newly acquired League of Nations mandate of Palestine Jordan, and Iraq. Into the understanding of the Middle East. Under his initiative, the Middle East Department was created in February 1921 in an effort to consolidate Britain's imperial interest in the era. Churchill's focus on the Middle East reflected the region's growing importance of to the British global system of power that had been developed from the 19th century, according to Darwin. At almost all times between the 1800s and 1960s, the British interests in the Middle East were regarded as a greater political and strategic value, and more deserving of protection than those in almost any other part of the imperial system. 1999, page 160. The rest of this section will now unpack why this was the case, as an understanding of these considerations is integral to the process of decolonisation that we will investigate in later sections of this unit. 1.2. The consolidation of British power. To determine the borders of the new British mandates in the Middle East, as discussed in Unit 17, and to set out the broad approach of British administration there, Colonel Secretary Winston Churchill convened a conference in Cairo in March 1921. The Cairo Conference also aimed to resolve the conflicting policies of Mihran-Hussein Correspondence 1915, by which Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi has sought British support for a post-war unified Arab state. The Sykes-Picot Agreement 1916, which had demarcated British and French spheres of influence in the Arab areas, and the Balfour Declaration 1917, by which Britain had promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Or in T.E. Lawrence's words, they need to make straight all the tangle, finding solutions without sacrificing any interest of our empire or any interest of the people concerned. This was to prove it an impossible circle to square. Each of these policies had served pressing wartime objects rather than long-time interest, and repercussions of them, these overlapping and contradictory promises, were to be long-lasting. The sole woman in the photograph, Gertrude Bell, was one of the best travellers in the Middle East before the First World War. Critical of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, Bell served as an Oriental Secretary in the British High Commission Advisory Group in Iraq throughout the 1920s. She became an important government advisor in Iraq and author of its 1924 constitution. Despite T. Lawrence's statement in a letter to his brother that everybody Middle East is here. Cavalry 2004, only 2 of the 40 delegates, Jafar al-Askari, the Sassoon Effendi, were from the region. In addition, more than half the men were in military uniform, which speaks to the precise nature of the discussion. Long after the formal end of the war, concerning power in Iraq and surrounding regions. On August 1921, Fiscal Faisal I was made king of the newly created Iraq, which was made up of the Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra. These were in fact home to contrasting and in times hostile populations, Kurds predominant in arid and mountainous Mosul, which is sat in the north, Sunni Arabs in Baghdad and its surrounds, and Shia Arabs and Basra, which was found in the country's south. The decision taken at Churchill's Cairo conference was part of the so-called Sharafian solution to appoint 2 sons of Hashemite, Sharaf Hussein bin Ali al-Hashimi, Faisal and Abdullah, to rule over Iraq and Jordan Faisal was deemed the most suitable candidate, a decision supported by advisors Bell and Lawrence in the mistake belief that he would be accepted by both the Sunnis and Shias because he was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. Shias believed only descendants could be with Caliph or the leader of Islam. He had also ingratiated himself by supporting anti-French protests in Syria amidst continuing Anglo-French internal imperial competitiveness in the Middle East. The sheriffs, or the Hellas, which is on the western coast of Arabia, had enormous prestiges as guardians of Islam. Most holy site, Mecca's mosque with its Kaaba. The Kaaba is a stone building in the center of the holy mosque in Mecca, in which all Muslims aspire to make Hajj or pilgrimage at least once. This and their involvement in the Arab uprising helped to explain British hopes that kings created from this lineage would be acceptable in the newly created mandates of Transjordan and Iraq. However, the new king of Iraq, as we'll discuss further, did not have the support of its majority of Shia population, while the British helped him to campaign and win over a minority of Sunnis. Religion still trumped any feelings of Arab nationalism. Rising regional tensions and Second World War considerations, while indirect rule and benevolent paternalism was preferred by the British initially in the region. This evolved into treaty-based hegemony under the mandate system, as explored in the previous unit, in instances where formal independence had been acknowledged, such as in Egypt 1922 and Iraq in 1932. The preferred approach in the years leading up to the Second World War was one of the informal rule in terms of Britain's access to all that mattered most to it. The basis, economic interest, influence, little would change after these territories were granted formal independence, however, retaining what was effectively British control over vital strategic and economic interests served to further intensify anti-colonial nationalisms and compound resentment from past failed promises, resentments made worse by anger at growing Jewish settlement to an influence in Palestine. Thus, the latter interwar period saw increased threats from Arab resistance, movements to British control in the region. In Palestine, these was Arab hostility not only to the Jewish settlers but to the mandate itself. This was further supercharged by Zionist movements committed by setting up a Jewish state in the area, yet managing mandatory Palestine was about to get more, not less, difficult. Britain's attempt to limit Jewish immigration on the principle of country's economic absorptive capacity proved increasingly difficult to enforce, particularly when Hitler's racism caused a post-1933 surge in the number of migrants. The Nuremberg laws, which were issued in September 1935 and stripped Jews of German citizenship, further increased immigration to Palestine with over 60,000 citizenship. Further increased immigration to Palestine with over 60,000 arrivals that year, when the British High Commission suggested setting up another Arab Jewish legislative body with an Arab majority based on population figures. Its rejection by the British Jewish population, prompted the Arab Revolt of 1936. That revolt lasted 3 blood-filled years, required 20,000 British troops to subdue it. Arab attacks on fellow Arabs who were seen as traitors, as well as on Jews and British soldiers, prompted equal retaliation. In response, Britain sent a Royal Commission headed by Lord Peel to make recommendations which were published in July 1937. What might it tell us about the consequences of early events such as the Balfour Declaration in Palestine? We learned this in Unit 17. What does the extract suggest about complexity of Palestine and its wider British role in the Middle East? In order to obtain support in the Arab War, the British government promised that Sharif of the Mecca in 1915 that in the event of an Allied victory, the greater part of the Arab provinces of the Turkish Empire would become independent. The Arabs understood that Palestine would be included in a sphere of independence. In order to obtain support of world Jewry, the British government in 1917 issued the Balfour Declaration. The Jews understood that if the experiment of establishing a Jewish national home succeeded, a sufficient number of Jews went to Palestine. The national home might develop in course of time into a Jewish state.